So hello back, fellow not yet Hegelians or Hegelians, I don't know. We want to read Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. Again, we're about to finish it during the next 3 sessions, I believe. So if you really followed like these small readings, then my compliments to you. You're really interested in philosophy. Thank you very much for joining me. If you enjoy these lectures, if you made it up to here, you probably already subscribed. Otherwise, just give me a like. It helps spread the word and read more Hegel. So yeah, what are we talking about today? Let's just dive into the text because it's a complicated text, and I think at this level where we are, I don't need to give much introduction anymore. We just go on. So let me just kind of summarize what we did before. I have to admit that I lose the thread of thought also a little bit. So therefore, let's look into the structure again. So we talk again about the paradox that we have, that a philosophy of history exists in time, while philosophy itself is about the eternal, and how could that be? And Hegel tries to solve this paradox by saying, well, look, this is what the idea is. The idea is developing, and the concrete parts are necessary for the whole it constitutes. And the whole, which is the totality of all thoughts and understood as the absolute idea, the whole is nothing that is determinate, because see, if it includes everything, it somehow also has to discuss itself. But if it determines itself, it would determine itself from the outside, and that's usually called a standpoint of nowhere in philosophy. It would be external to itself, and therefore it would not have determined everything, right? So philosophy that takes itself to be seriously needs to define itself from the inside. And reason, not understanding, understanding is about determinate things, but reason, which is the capability of humans reflecting on themselves, has this capacity. It's called reflection. It's another mode of thinking. It's not deduction or induction. It's something else. We may maybe have to talk about that on a deeper level at some point, not here, but in very abstract terms, it is about the mind and its activity, and its major activity is to know itself. And that is what we discussed. The existence of the mind, that is being, is its activity. And now, of course, we also talk about nature, that is an externalization in time, but which is understood from the standpoint of the mind. We're not understanding nature from a standpoint of nowhere. No, we understand also the mind, the nature from the internal standpoint of the mind that externalizes itself. Now, of course, we don't discuss mind just as this individual being that we are, but because we try to know ourselves, and so in this sense we are not yet entirely ourselves, we see that the mind has not arrived at itself in the full form, even though it participates in the full form. And the full form is real and here, so it's a kind of combination of Plato and Aristotle, if you will. But even though it's not yet fully formed, it already has itself. And in that sense, it's a kind of relation between what is very limited as an individual me, and it expands itself to the universal that it wants to become. So it's kind of in between the universal and the individual. And I always say the combination of the universal and individual which are probably moments of the same thing, not maybe real entities, rather abstract moments. So in a sense, they are real. So these universals and individuals are moments of the concrete mind that we are. Okay, we have to ask, what is a mind? And a mind wants to grasp the universal, the aim of philosophy, which is truth. Okay, maybe that's too complicated. I hope it's not too complicated at this point. I feel like in many aspects I have to do it more systematically, and it's a little bit convoluted right now. I admit that. And therefore, at this stage, I believe it's always good to go back into the text so that we have something that we can hold on together. So let's see where we have been last time. I think we have been here. But those who believe the principle of diversity to be one absolutely fixed do not know its nature or its dialectic. The manifold or diverse is in a state of flux. It must really be conceived of as in the process of development and as but a passing moment. Philosophy in its concrete idea is the activity of development in revealing the differences which it contains within itself. These differences are thoughts, for we are now speaking of development in thought. Okay, so he gives here a definition of philosophy. And this is a process of development, more so an activity of the mind. And what does this activity do? It reveals differences. And of course, for this, there have to be differences in place. So we discover differences and they are necessary, and the manifold appearances of philosophy don't contradict the fact that there is philosophy. Philosophers debating with each other what is true. Philosophers debating which Hegel interpretation is true. That is philosophy. Philosophers debating whether Hegel has to be read in a completely historical manner, which is an extremist view on my side possibly. And philosophers who argue, no, there is a fixed form of being, a necessary underlying structure. These debates between these philosophers are what philosophy is. And I say, well, this debate is historical. Gotcha. Maybe. So, in the first place, the differences which rest in the idea are manifested as thoughts. So, yeah, like the idea needs to be determined in itself so that it is knowable, and what we find inside of the idea are thoughts that we all have, and now we have to systematically order them. Secondly, these distinctions must come into existence, one here and the other there. So these thoughts are manifested at different points in time, namely when the implicit universal mind makes itself explicit through a form of intuition, which is time, and by that possibly constitutes a history. Not every occurrence in time is necessarily a historical event. That's also what we have to keep in mind by distinguishing what is time and history. And in order that they may do this, they must be complete. That is, they must contain within themselves the idea in its totality. So, for a difference to be thought, it has to be part of something that is more than itself. If a thought would be an independent, self-contained unity, a universal, then we could never approach it from an individual standpoint. Then we would just share in one universal godlike mind. But I think Hegel is very well aware that we are, as concrete beings, somehow reconstructing ourselves as individuals. So in that sense, we have to participate in the universal and in the individual at the same time. It's kind of a paradox, but I think it gets also dissolved with the idea of the concrete. The concrete alone, as including and supporting these distinctions, is the actual. It is thus and thus alone that the differences are in their form entire. So what is the concrete here? I would say, well, it's the actual, das Wirkliche, that which really works, not das Reale. Okay, he says explicitly das Wirkliche. Actually, I don't know whether he says it in the original of this translation, but I assume, because usually that's what he's talking about, because here we talk about something that works, that has a Wirkung, that has effects, that does something. So, and the concrete is that which is discovered in ourselves as what we take to be reality. Whatever this reality is, doesn't matter. Okay? We're not talking about the in itself, the complete totality condensed into an abstract thought. That's not what we do. We just talk about what we experience, and that's why I always call Hegel an empirical realist and not a metaphysical realist, as there is, for example, in my mind, Kant. Okay, so a complete form of thought, such as here presented, is a philosophy, but the idea contains the distinctions in a particular form. It may be said that the form is indifferent and that the content, the idea, is the main consideration. And people think themselves quite moderate and reasonable when they state that the different philosophies all contain the idea, though in different forms, understanding by this that these forms are contingent. So we read that the last time already. So now it really comes to the paradox, well, do we have mere content and then like the people as individuals are just perceiving it in different forms, and then behind this there's this gray and gray mass that is like a, I don't know how to call it, like Kant calls it das Gewühl, the whirling, I don't know how to call it in English. Well, Hegel says, no, that's not reasonable. The form is the content and the content is the form. It has to be distinguished, otherwise it would not be. The manifold character of the principles which appear is, however, not accidental but necessary. The different forms constitute an integral part of the whole form. Okay, so we got that. Let's go on. I mean, I repeat, like this is really a lot of repetition from the last time we read it together, so I apologize for that, but I think it cannot hurt if we dive into that again. Each system is determined as one, but is not in a permanent condition that the difference are thus mutually exclusive. The inevitably fate of these determinations must follow, and that is that they shall be drawn together and reduced to elements or moments. The independent attitude taken up by each moment is again laid aside. After expansion, contraction follows the unity out of which the first emerged. So it's a process where we contract, where we expand, contract, expand, kind of dialectic, though we don't want to break it down to a formal mechanism. It's not mechanistic, it's way more organic, and it depends on the concrete conditions at each moment how this dialectic will unfold. I think the only thing that we can say is that so far we never stay with the abstract. And the abstract is the condensed thought in a simple predicative sentence. It may seem as if this progression were to go on into infinitude, but it has an absolute end in view which we shall know better later on. Many turnings are necessary, however, before mind frees itself in coming to consciousness. So here we have an end, but see, if you have a circle, the end is itself, and Hegel says, of course, it's a circle that improves upon itself. There is not necessarily an end, as we have that in Marx's interpretation. So for that, let's look at the Marxist interpretation of that. Here we have an end which is communism. And not until not every person is free, no person is free. Like, we had to ask what freedom means in that sense. And I think Hegel is following the idea that humans are so free that, or their goal is freedom in such a manner that even such a constituted society would fall at some point apart. Kind of a world state of communism. I don't think Hegel would say that, but that is also a huge debate. And I can only make transparent to you what kind of side I follow. I'm not saying that the other side is entirely reasonable, even though I tend to sometimes talk sarcastically and mock them. That doesn't necessarily mean that I entirely reject their arguments. I wish we would know the end. I think that is the aim of philosophy, to figure out the whole and true purpose of this universe, of our lives, and to understand the complete structure of mind-external reality. But since we cannot do that, I recommend the second best option, which is relativism. Okay, so here we stopped, and here the new thoughts emerge. I'm sorry, where is it? Yeah, here. The temple of self-consciousness. The temple of self-conscious reason is to be considered from this, the point of view alone worthy of the history of philosophy. So why is reason only worth to be considered from the standpoint of the history of philosophy? That's a pretty strong claim here. And something's wrong with my mouth and my mouse. So I just jumped ahead. Sorry for the confusion. I just want to mark that for myself here again, because I have to think about that more. Man, my mouse is hurting me. Okay, come on, stop this. So it is hence, maybe I use here the arrow keys. Okay, it is hence rationally built by an inward master worker, and not in Solomon's method as Freemasons built. Okay, this is what I don't understand. I don't know what he refers to here, but he says it is built from the inside. There is no outside perspective, nothing that is outside of reason. I also want that. The great assumption that what has taken place on this side in the world has also done so in conformity with reason, which is what first gives the history of philosophy. Its true interest is nothing else than trust in providence, only in another form. Okay, so there's an assumption that we have again, and that's in conformity with reason. And that it wants to, I guess, predict the future. As the best of what is in the world is that which thought produces, it is unreasonable to believe that reason only is in nature and not in the mind. Okay, so we always have like the assumption that the mind somehow distorts reality, and that nature is that which is true, and we have to get closer to nature and somehow kill the subjective side of our thinking, and then we just hold the bare naked objects in our hands. I don't know how that goes in line with the sentence. I have to read this again about the great assumption. Let's go on a bit. If you have like an interpretation of that, let me know in the comments. It's this sentence here. I'm not entirely sure what it means. Also, what is Solomon's method and Freemasons built? You can also let me know about that. I would be very thankful for that. Okay, that man who believes that what, like the philosophies, belongs to the region of mind must be merely contingent is insincere in his belief in divine rule, and what he says of it is but empty talk. So, okay, he doesn't give you an argument, he just says that this man who thinks that philosophy theories are just contingent. That means they are a result of an external nature and don't follow an inherent principle. He's wrong. Okay, but let's read this sentence again. The great assumption that what has taken place on this side, I guess like in the Solomon's method as the Freemasons build, it's also done so in conformity with reason. Oh, okay. So providence is the biblical theory, I guess, that there is a goal that God has placed into the world and that we follow that one, and it's not an inside worker who develops that. But I think Hegel wants to say, well, Jesus became man, right? It's an inward principle. I believe to understand that way. And so he says if it's external, if that principle is external, we couldn't understand it. I think this is a discussion about religion that I didn't capture like the first moment I read it. It's not so important for our purposes to read. It's more a debate about Christianity that took place at that time and that became more prevalent towards the end of Hegel's life when he was still holding these lectures again and again. And it may have been included in this. Not entirely sure on that one. A long time is undoubtedly required by mind in working out philosophy, and when one first reflects on it, the length of the time may seem astonishing, like the immensity of the space spoken of in astronomy. So we don't just develop thoughts very simply. It takes a long time. That's what he says here. But it must be considered in regard to the slow progress of the world spirit that there is no need for it to hasten. 1,000 years are in thy sight as one day. So as we talk about the slow progress of the way the world moves and develops, which Hegel captures as world spirit, we really don't need to hurry. It has time enough just because it is self outside of time, because it is eternal. Okay, this is like the position of a sage here, right? But see, he says the eternal is outside of time. And time is a category of our intuition. Maybe it's wrong to say category. It's a form of our intuition. But when he talks about the history, he doesn't include that anymore in the concept of time. That is one of my interpretations of Hegel. And actually in the Phenomenology of Spirit, he talks about the annulment of time, which is not the annulment of history. It's an important point that we should keep in mind for later interpretations. The fleeting events of the day pass so quickly that there is not time enough for all that has to be done. Who is there who does not die before he has achieved his aims? The world spirit has time enough, but that is not all. It is not time alone which has to be made use of in the acquisition of conception. Much else is required. The fact that so many races and generations are devoted to these operations of its consciousness by mind, and that the appearance is so perpetually presented of rising up and passing away, concern it not at all. It is rich enough for such displays. It pursues its work on the largest possible scale, and has nations and individuals enough and to spare. The saying that nature arrives at its end in the shortest possible way, and that is right, is a trivial one. The way shown by mind is indirect and accommodates itself to circumstances. Okay, so he talks here about world spirit that has a very long way in view, and it does not just include the individual, but includes the universal progress of humans that build a way of philosophy. Philosophy is a road that goes through all of these heads of these thinking spirits who preserve its essence and build its way historically. And so this world spirit here is a personification, like a real human being, can sacrifice the individuals on its way. It does not so by killing them or involving them in wars, but it just waits in its eternal patience. And then we talk about the mind that we have every day and which indirectly works on that path and that accommodates to contingent events. Like now I feel hunger, I have to sneeze again. YouTube may not load fast enough, but you still want to walk the way of the universal mind that is paved on the shoulders of the individuals and leads through world history. We ought to feel no disappointment that particular kinds of knowledge cannot be attained, or that this is still absent. I feel like talking a bit like Owen Wilson here, because it reminds me of the new show Loki and the ministers of time that try to preserve the correct way of time itself. And of course, if you do something that is contingent, it does not alter the eternal timeline. Okay, I'm not a good impersonator, right? But I still try. So, in the history of the world, progression is slow. So the progression is slow, but he believes here in progress, right? Are we justified to believe in this progress? I don't know. Hegel, as Zizek says, is the philosopher who's most open for the future. So maybe he doesn't believe in this progress either. But if we really want to do philosophy, we have to hope for this kind of progress. No edifying intent here. It's just saying that we have to forge the concepts that stand in line with whatever is seen to be progress. Otherwise, we give ourselves away to the contingency and we fall into the nothing besides the path of world spirit. Okay, so the application of the foregoing to the treatment of philosophy. I want to read a very little part of that. I want to say something about the necessity and then we can finish. So the first result, which follows from what has been said, is that the whole of the history of philosophy is a progression impelled by an inherent necessity and one which is implicitly rational and a priori determined through its idea. Yeah, now we can say, well, see, there's a clear teleology in Hegel that contradicts my hypothesis of historicity. I clearly see that. And this, the history of philosophy has to exemplify. I'm sorry, I just read what he says here. But I want to give it a little bit of a different drive, a different turn. So let's go on a bit. Like the question would be, what is a priori and what is inherent necessity? Contingency must vanish on the appearance of philosophy. So and if we think about what contingency is related to time. It's related to our normal lives, of me drinking a glass of water, which may not alter the course of the world spirit, okay? But a great idea that many other minds adopt, that may change the path of world spirit. Its history is just as absolutely determined as the development of notions, and the impelling force is the inner dialectic of forms. And so, yeah, I agree with that. If there is something that pushes world history further, it is a form that can be seen as building upon others, and the forms that are before, they have to be necessary. So now how do I understand that? If we go back to this diagram that we talked about before. So I'm not saying that the end is necessarily communism, but see, I think if we want to get from, let's say, slavery to capitalism, we necessarily need something that, like feudalism. We cannot just jump from slavery to capitalism, or let's say from primitive communism to this stage of the societal development. And so I understand that these necessities are in a sense a priori, and a priori here means just that there are, as Kant expresses by his two attributes, there are notwendig und allgemein, necessary and universal. It doesn't mean that they are only before experience. There are categories of thought, the way we apply our reason in order to understand something. And so we cannot understand the progression of ideas in time without using the idea of necessity and without using meta concepts, as Brandon would say, that are metaphysical. Okay, so this may be very hard for an introduction to Hegel to be understood. But yeah, the question is, what do we understand as a priori here? And I want to point out that many people reconstruct Hegel as a philosopher of the a posteriori. But I admit that this path that I'm taking here requires a lot of interpretation. And the question would be, why does he say it this way here? If you're interested in that question, Walter Jeschke, the main editor of the complete works of Hegel, I mentioned him before, has written a very interesting preface in the publication of Miner. It's called Miner, M-E-I-N-E-R. And yeah, I would recommend to read his take on this fact. Okay, but the inward idea, so the finite is not true, nor is it what it is to be. Its determinate nature is bound up with its existence. So yeah, it's going against the finite, right? We have to free it from the finite, even though the finite is necessary. I mean, that's what he says too. Okay? I'm sorry, did I skip something? Let's first read the sentence. Its history is just as absolutely determined as the development of notions, and its impelling force is the inner dialectic of the forms. That should be clear by now. So there's an inner principle, I wouldn't say principle, but there's a dialectic going on that we can reconstruct in terms of forms that are of course related to the content. They are not empty. Oh, I'm sorry, I should switch back here, okay? So the finite is not true, nor is it what it is to be. Its determinate nature is bound up with its existence. So yeah, the finite by itself is not what is true, it's only abstract, right? And then we see it in a dialectic going from one finite form to the next. But it is also not what will be in the future. So its determinate nature is bound up with its existence. So the truth of all of that is in the real existing history, but we abstract it here, or we free it from our intuition of time. But the inward idea abolishes these finite forms. A philosophy which has not the absolute form identical with the content must pass away because its form is not that of truth. And this is what I said, even when I'm a relativist. We need an aim of truth, and this aim tells us in a very rough way of how we want to look at the world. And if we look at the world only as an aggregate of contingencies without ordering it, so what? Why do we do it? Right? But if we still want to achieve knowledge, then we are in this Hegelian structure, which I claim is still a relativism, and which still means that we entirely depend on the historical revelation of the finite forms that we then try to free from their contingency and to understand them with respect to something that we construct as the absolute. Now, what is this absolute? Let's look into that quickly too. Let's synthesize. Where did I put it? Where did I put it? No, I may have the absolute idea. This is a very good graphic, right? That's the absolute. You understand it. A circle of circles. Okay, I always find these exemplifications a bit irritating because what do they really say? But here's a better one. I didn't make that. I found that in the internet. So the idea here is that we need a system of categories that we possibly can reconstruct in order to interpret the world. And like if we don't construct such a system, we just give ourselves away to contingency. Now, some people claim that this logic of Hegel is like the internal engine, the machine of the universe, where he says, in this section, by the way, he doesn't just say that in the philosophy of right, but he also says that in the chapter on objectivity, that what is actual is reasonable and what is reason is actual. So people usually translate that differently. I don't really appreciate that. They say what is real is rational and what is rational is the real. But he uses a bit of a different word in German. And most people read that in the philosophy of right, and they don't look like in the specific section of the logic where he talks about the very same subject, the very same topic. And there it is really like where he says, yeah, I mean, subjectivity alone is not enough. We need an idea of objectivity. And there we come to an idea of teleology, right? We need that kind of objectivity. But that doesn't mean that it's independent from the subject, right? It means that the way we look at the world by virtue of reason is the way we reconstruct it. And we have to apply that principle of objectivity in order to understand it. And then if we think of that, we get the absolute idea that is the guiding idea for us as human beings, where we know ourselves so far in history of how we reconstruct the history of philosophy and the history of the world in general. Complicated shit, right? Now, some people claim that this here is the completed system, but I follow here Sally Sedgwick, and she says, no, it's also a historical achievement in the history of philosophy. And Hegel himself, he said, it's not complete. If Plato wrote his Republic 7 times, his Science of Logic, which I'm talking here about, should have been written at least 77 times, which he didn't do. Okay, I hope this was not too complicated, but I said we are already pretty much in the lectures of Hegel. I hope you get addicted to the dialectic, because I think this is really the best way to do philosophy. Second best way, of course, the best way is to just know what reality really is, but we don't know, so we should stick with dialectic. Okay, so thank you for your attention. Give this video a like, follow more lectures on this, more readings together. Actually, I hope that we can read it together, but I think it's a bit illusionary, because who would ever watch such videos? Maybe you stumble upon contingently, and maybe you don't even listen to this point. But maybe I do it for the hope. The hope that we venture into a future where we talk about philosophy more than we talk about the Kardashians. So therefore, live long, watch less the Kardashians, read more Hegel, and prosper.